but it's heavier in the express lanes with delays pushing to 35th. There was an earlier crash in that area. The Eisenhower runs 29 minutes from 390 to downtown. Metro trains are back on the modified weekday schedule. South Shore lines are on the regular schedule. That's traffic. I'm Jim Talamonte on AM 560 The Answer.
Chicago's Morning Answer continues next. In our 1-hour heating and air conditioning weather center, sunny and 90 today. Mainly clear and warm overnight, lows 70. Currently 67. Next news at 8. Breaking news as it happens. Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy continues next on AM 560, The Answer.
Listen to AM 560, The Answer, online at 560theanswer.com, on the AM 560 mobile app, on your Alexa-powered smart speaker, on TuneIn, iHeart, and radio.com. If you're looking for the latest news, insight into what it means, and the sharpest opinion, there's only one station in Chicago where you can turn, and it's this one. We're AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Anecdotes that don't get enough attention to balance out the pandemonium that's being amplified by the press corps. Officer Galen Hinshaw in Louisville, Kentucky. He was in a sea of protesters and, blocked off from getting to his vehicle. He was alone. He was worried they were going to turn on him.
Yeah.
They could have. It was at that moment a man emerged from the crowd in a red University of Louisville mask covering the lower half of his face. He put himself between the closest protester and Hinshaw. Local entrepreneur Darren Lee Jr. spotted Hinshaw, the cop, and the advancing crowd and linked arms with the stranger in the red mask who had first stepped up to help the cop. Once I saw the guy in the red mask step up, I said, "I got to step up," said Lee, who also runs a child care center. It was just reactive. I just went. I really thought at that moment, protect him. It really isn't his fault. Lee was worried that the officer, Hinshaw, would react and hit him from behind, so he tried to reassure the officer they were going to protect him. He was looking nervous and scared. If he panicked, then there was going to be a war out there. Ultimately, 5 men formed a human shield to protect Officer Hinshaw.
Good.
All of them strangers to one another. Nobody knew the name of the man to his left or to the right. They were 3 black, 1 white, 1 Dominican, all linking arms to keep harm away from Hinshaw, himself half Pakistani. A human was in trouble, and right is right, said Ricky McClellan, a factory worker from Old Louisville who was locked into Lee's left arm, the entrepreneur who had stepped up.
And they needed to do that. I mean, if people forget, here in Chicago, last Saturday and the last weekend's rioting, and it was rioting, not protesting, we had 130 Chicago police officers injured. Not 20 that David Brown initially thought, 130. And 2 of them required surgeries.
Yes, and the point here is that you have some people that are engaged in violence on the streets, and you have a lot of people who are not. You have some people that are upset about what those Minneapolis police officers did to George Floyd, understandably. Everybody is, actually.
Yeah.
That's why this is so silly, is because there's no argument, really.
Exactly.
But they also recognize, as these guys in Louisville who helped this cop there, that, this guy, I don't know. There's no reason to believe this cop is a bad dude, and he's not doing anything other than just trying to avoid conflict. So let's protect him so that those who are less enlightened don't make this worse than it already is. Oh, and by the way,
Right.
since Black Lives Matter and all black people hate cops, that's false. False. Wrong.
I hate cops.
The majority, and it's been this way forever. The majority of black Americans in inner cities support the cops and want more of them. By more than a 2-to-1 margin, black Americans support the police. 60% of black Americans want more police hired, according to a Civis poll published by Vox this week. Vox, left wing. Other groups support the police even more strongly than that. It is a small group of people who have an outsized voice because of the small group of people in the D.C. press corps who are ignoramuses. Small group of people. It's not black and white monolith. It's individual Philistines against the rest of people who want to live in a civilized world. That's what it actually is. For more on this, we're pleased to be joined by Will Reilly, Associate Professor of Poli-Sci at Kentucky State University, author of Hate Crime Hoax, How the Left is Selling a Fake Race War. Will, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Glad to be back on, Dan.
And I know you're a data-driven guy, so you heard me addressing what is one canard, I believe. What is the lie that's being repeated the most often that is the most disturbing to you?
Well, I think the issue with the Black Lives Matter narrative in general. So first of all, I want to agree with you. I mean, I found the George Floyd tape disgusting. I mean, we've all seen that. I have a legal background as well as political science. I actually think you could prove murder two, if not, well, probably not murder one, but murder charges, nothing less, against at least Chauvin. We're all on the same page against extreme police brutality. And as you said, that's what makes this so odd. The question isn't, should we discipline dirty cops? It's not, should we punish people who commit crimes of violence? I mean, civilized societies have agreed on those things for, in many cases, centuries. The question is, do we need sweeping reforms? In Minneapolis, they're talking about dismantling the police department. In fact, I think they voted to do it in at least some non-binding way. 9 out of 13 members of the city council currently are backing total suspension of what we'd consider normal policing. And I think that the numbers used to justify that position are probably the biggest untruth in this whole situation. So you very frequently hear activists that present under that broad label of Black Lives Matter say things like thousands of black men each year are killed or brutalized by police. Cherno Biko went on Fox News, I believe, 2 years back and said every 28 hours a black man, I believe he mentioned an unarmed black man, is murdered by the police. That turns out to be flatly untrue. There's a comprehensive database of police killings kept by the Washington Post that you can find just by Googling Washington Post police shootings database. Last year, the total number of unarmed black men killed by police was 15. And that number, for whatever reason, has increased over the past week from 9, which is what they had it listed as for nearly a year.
Right.
That would be the last year on record, 2019. Total number of unarmed people in general killed by the police was 56. So black people are not even very disproportionate within that group. Only about 1,000 police killings nationally in the entire year. Many of those involved someone, for example, attacking an officer. 621 of those people had a gun on them, usually an illegal firearm. Only 229 of those, a little over 20%, involved African Americans at all. So the idea that there's an epidemic of police murders and thus we need to defund or disband the police, that at root is not true. Out of 3 million odd people that unfortunately pass away every year, we see in a typical year perhaps 900 to 1,000 of those people die in encounters with the police. And that's been very consistent for a decade. I mean, there doesn't seem to be, bluntly, an epidemic problem here at all. And I think the presentation of this as though there is, which the media plays a big role in, is incredibly dishonest. Yeah. George Floyd is not the norm. George Floyd is one of 9 to 15 guys who had an experience like this in the entire country over 365 days. So punish those officers involved, but the last thing we need is to pull police out of poor and minority communities.
Yeah, but you try to explain that to people on the left, and they call you a racist. If you just try to give them the facts, it's unbelievable. All right, so I wanted to ask you, so this movement began with, arrest the officer, which they did, and then it was said, arrest all 3 officers, the other 3, which they did, to denouncing racism, to, kicking, well, here in Chicago, CPD out of CPS, and to defund police, and now they just want to abolish police in total. And in Minneapolis, they want to use social workers instead of police officers for, say, domestic violence calls.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so there are specific goals that the hard left has, just as I imagine there are specific goals the hard right has. But if you look through many policy documents that come out of that edge left sector, whether you're talking about the Green New Deal or the overall platform for Black Lives Matter, which is interesting to read, which you can find online by searching that, the phrase I just used, almost all of them contain the same goals: moving toward a more socialized society, moving toward a more disarmed society, so on. So you often find people advocating for these goals even in situations that don't really call for them or don't have anything to do with them. So, again, I mean, I agree that we should punish individual corrupt officers, but we don't see that there's a surplus of those officers. And you're right, a lot of these things don't really have much of anything to do with what happened to George Floyd. George Floyd, to some extent, is being used by a larger pre-existing political movement to go after goals that that movement already had. There's nothing racist about opposing that.
Well, to that point, Black Lives Matter co-founder Alicia Garza saying so much of policing right now is generated and directed towards quality of life issues, homelessness, drug addiction, domestic violence. What we need is increased funding for housing. We need increased funding for education. We need increased funding for quality of life communities who are over-policed and over-surveilled. I mean, she sounds like any run-of-the-mill leftist politician.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things about this is what was mentioned in the lead-in to my segment here, which is that 60 to 70% of the members of every American ethnic group, African Americans, Italian Americans, whites, overall Hispanics, like the police and generally want more police in their neighborhoods. So obviously, I mean, I broadly agree with that analysis. This is something that ties into deeper goals. But one thing we have to remember here is that if you actually pull back the police, the people that suffer are going to be the people that live in poor and minority neighborhoods that want more police. And having I've taught some criminal justice courses as well as political science classes, and one very basic point here is that the cops aren't in minority neighborhoods just so they can, quote unquote, screw with black people. The entire model of modern post-Bratton CompStat policing is that you send the most officers where there is the most crime. And to deter crime, you do things like pat down potential criminals for minor offenses. You look for weed charges, pistol charges, so on. But that's done in response to a pattern of serious violent crime. And what we see, this is the entire idea of broken windows policing, what we very consistently see is that that tends to reduce major crime. If you find someone with an illegal pistol on his waistband, he can't use that to shoot somebody. So when people say things like the police should be taken entirely off a proactive footing, they shouldn't be allowed to sweep the streets, they shouldn't be allowed to do stop and frisk, clean up homeless encampments, what that's going to do almost certainly is dramatically increase crime. I mean, if you cut the number of cops by half and you tell them they can't do anything proactive, you're going to see a surge in crime in those neighborhoods that most need policing. Now, one of the things that's taboo here but kind of obvious is that, quote-unquote, the hood among all races isn't over-policed, it's under-policed, i.e., relative to the amount of crime that you have, you don't have as many officers as you'd expect. So in a neighborhood that has 6 times the normal crime rate, you might have twice as many cops as the average neighborhood would, but you don't have 6 times as many. So that creates a tough situation where you have more officers, so there are more violent encounters with officers, but you don't have enough officers to actually keep crime down where it should be. That creates the worst of both worlds. And that's why if you ever go to a town hall in one of these neighborhoods and you ask, what do you guys need? What they say is, we need this neighborhood to be treated like any other neighborhood. We need enough cops that there's not crime. We need working fire services, so on. Pulling those services back would be unimaginably cruel to some extent. I don't know what people think you're going to have in a poor neighborhood if you have, for example, Antifa fighters or local gang members or social workers or something like that doing a crude imitation of policing, but it won't be good.
Will Hurd, the Republican congressman from Texas, had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and he talked about one of the issues that's brought up routinely as well, which is the getting rid of bad officers. I understand, we understand in police forces of 13 to 35,000 officers, you're going to have some bad officers, but it's the problem of them being reinstated. He writes that, citing a Washington Post study, in the last decade, the nation's departments fired at least 1,881 officers for misconduct, yet 451 were later reinstated, most after arbitration. And he writes that one of the things that can be done at the federal level is to empower police chiefs to fire bad officers and keep them off the force permanently, but he doesn't say how. And some are suggesting one of the ways how is, okay, men and women of the left, let's go after the union that protects officers at all costs. Are you game for that?
Yeah, I mean, I can actually explicitly tell you either from that CJ perspective or that legal perspective how you could do that. I mean, you could take what are known as qualified immunity provisions and third chances provisions out of police union contracts.
Right.
What a lot of people don't seem to understand is that there's a framework of real adult law that governs what we do. I mean, I remember being a young, kind of radical kid myself, but at the time I was pretty dumb. And you see this same
come a
kind
long
of
way.
passion. I'm a grown man now. I mean, me holding my skateboard at 18, I mean, I would have said all kind of things about policing and so on, but none of them would have been correct. I mean, so, but looking at this, I mean, when people say, for example, in the Chauvin case, why didn't they bring charges immediately against all 4 officers? Well, because you can't. I mean, if you're talking about a probable homicide case, you need a COD on record. This is the most basic element of law or of policing. You can't just charge people with felonies. So that's why there was that 2 to 3 day wait there that to some extent led to the rioting. And just knowing that would have probably prevented the rioting. Same thing with these police contracts. When people say, well, why do they give these crooked cops desk duty if they shoot somebody? Because there's a 2-page provision in every contract that says you have to. No police chief likes doing that. They don't like paying someone who's probably a bad cop that they're going to fire at the end of the 2 months. But by law, if you signed a sign a contract with the public sector union, that's what's going to happen. So, yeah, there are real solutions here. Like taking qualified immunity out of union contract is a real solution. But when you say something like taking qualified immunity out of union contracts, that doesn't have, quite the same ring to it as burn, baby, burn. So everyone agrees on the actual solutions here. And nobody, I'm a pro-black guy, as I often know. I teach at a historically black college. Nobody wants crooked cops out there arresting black men, or for that matter, white or Hispanic men, by the way. But how do you stop that? Well, you have to sit down with the police unions and perhaps trade slightly higher salaries for a loss of qualified immunity. I mean, just kicking in the windows of a jewelry store isn't going to change how policing is done. It's probably going to get you arrested.
He is Will Reilly, Associate Professor of Poli-Sci at Kentucky State University, author of Hate Crime Hoax, How the Left is Selling a Fake Race War. Will, always a pleasure. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Dan. Bye.
Thanks. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
You're listening to Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
If you're a healthy, self-employed small business owner with income too high to qualify for an Obamacare subsidy, I have good